So here in our starting point at in the galleries of our museum, we are, as I already mentioned, in a very, very early time. Here you could see, just to inform you about the archaeological fieldwork, a photo how archaeological fieldwork was done in the late 19th and early 20th century. And of course, what we know about ancient Egypt is very much from tombs and graves. So the material culture is very much, and our knowledge about ancient Egypt through the looking glass of a dead person, so to speak, because the funerary cult was very much dependent on material culture and provision of the dead with goods which he might need for his eternal life. So that's a brief note in the beginning. However, the Egyptian culture, and we know much about this, started to develop script in the 4th millennium BCE, the end of the, in the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE. And one of the most early inscriptions we have here in our museum is indeed written on this huge calcite alabaster vessel, which you could see here. And you have to look a bit closer. You could see two signs which are carved into this objects. And these two hieroglyphs give a name of a person. In this case, it is a name of a queen. She lives roughly about 2900 BCE. Her name is Night, literally the one who is beloved by the goddess Night. And you have here already a link between a name or a person's name and an object. So the object is labeled with the person's name, making it clear for all eternity that this object belonged to this specific queen. So you have a marker. So one function of the written language from the very beginning was marking possessions and marking goods with names for persons who owns or who own this objects. And this is also kind of an administrative process. So we very much assume that language was developed first, the script was developed first to do, not academic, but to do records for trading. So that's administrative purposes, which seems to be the origin of the written script. However, from this point on, the Egyptians started to use this script not only for recording how many milk or how many vessels for this or this person was delivered, but they started to try to use this script to give more and precise information about the spoken language. So, and then from then on, a development took place, which ends up in the second half of the 3rd millennia BCE with the then more or less full developed system of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And the second object I would like to introduce you to is this very, very huge object with the most huge hieroglyphs we have here in Hildesheim. Currently, this is an object on loan from the Berlin Museum. And you could see a very characteristic hieroglyphic inscription having signs which are at the same time letters for the script and images of, for example, here a bird, or here the sun disk. This is more complicated. This is obviously part of an animal or something. Sometimes hieroglyphs are difficult to decipher what they were in reality. Same is true for example, for this sign, which might be kind of a leather sandal part. But Egyptologists think about this. I don't know if this is true or not. So what you also could see is that the language, and this is important for the decipherment of hieroglyphs, gives you some clues already. If you know that this is a royal inscription, then you might see that here some signs are written inside this circle, which is around this sign. So the circle, the so-called cartouche, marks that this is a royal name, and other signs are outside of this. So you could also already know, okay, now if you start to read this, this should be the name of a king, and this should then be other text, giving some information about the king. In this case, the name of the king is written, and this is also something which is typical for the Egyptian language, not so strictly from the beginning to the end, but the Egyptians could somehow change some letters in the orthography. In this case, for example, to bring the name of the sun god in the very first position in this name. So indeed, the name is written Sahu-Ra. So you start in the middle reading, and then the name of the sun god Ra is putting in front. Literally, this means a name, you could also translate, it's a grammatical construction, could be something like the king is in the vicinity or in the neighborhood or close to the sun god Ra. This is so called, this is also kind of a program of the king, the one who is close and familiar to the sun god Ra. And then you have attributes to the king. This sign, somebody might have seen this before, is the sign for life, Ankh. The next sign here is a sign for maintenance, for continuation, for somehow eternity, Jet. And then here starts a sign which is broken in the upper part, which is some kind of is luck or something like this, good luck. Difficult to translate. Good luck in particular for the king. And then there is the starting of another writing. Here is an S. Being part of something is broken off here, but we could clearly see that this is a word seneb, meaning health. So then we could see here, this is the name of the king. And then you could read on, he may live, may endure, may be happy, and may be healthy, which is of course fitting for a king. Being alive, being enduring for eternity, being lucky for eternity, and of course being in good health. So a very nice inscription for indeed a king. And so you have already now a very nice glimpse of how hieroglyphs work. And now we could proceed with how our school kids learn about hieroglyphs with another object which is more complicated than this one. So this is the easy step. Now we do the more complicated step. And therefore, follow my colleague.
Ich setze meinen Vortrag in Deutsch fort. Wenn Sie eine Pause brauchen, um es zu übersetzen, mache ich auch gern eine Pause. Ja, mein Kollege sagte es bereits, wir Vermittlerinnen brauchen nicht kleine Objekte, wir brauchen immer sehr große Objekte. Und bevor wir auf das Objekt zu sprechen kommen, versuchen wir erstmal mit unseren jungen Besucherinnen und Besuchern und den Erwachsenen ins Gespräch zu kommen. Und ins Gespräch kommt man am besten, indem man eine Frage stellt. Was steht hier geschrieben? Trauen Sie sich, es laut zu sagen. Genau, und die Kammer des Schreckens. So, wir lösen es gleich auf. Können Sie auch das lesen? Genau. So, dann gehen wir weiter. Wir schreiten voran. Was steht hier geschrieben? Sie merken, ich bin auch Geschichtsdidaktikerin. Ich brauche jetzt hier eine Transferleistung von Ihnen. Und meistens muss ich den Tipp geben, Es geht um die Leserichtung. Also, wir versuchen mit unserem Wissen, was wir hier haben, multiperspektivisch Wissen zu vermitteln. Und unsere Schreibweise von links nach rechts führt uns hier nicht weiter. Wenn wir es aber von rechts nach links lesen und gleichzeitig das, was wir mit den 2 anderen Tafeln schon gelernt haben, kombinieren, dann kommen wir zu der Lösung. Es ist noch ein halbes Jahr hin, bis es soweit ist, in Europa, das zumeist christlich geprägt ist. Na? Weihnachten. Genau, Weihnachten. Also, was habe ich Ihnen vermittelt mit wenigen Worten? Die alten Ägypter, gerade bei den Hieroglyphen, haben durchgehend geschrieben. Sie haben, das haben wir hier auch gemerkt, nein, Moment, das war jetzt die erste. Sie haben ohne Vokale geschrieben. Trotzdem können wir es lesen. Das ist ganz, ganz wichtig, wenn wir jungen Besuchern das vermitteln wollen. Wie funktioniert das ohne Vokale? Es funktioniert. Es funktioniert auch, wenn die Worte nicht voneinander abgetrennt sind, weil das ist auch eine bestimmte Form, wie die Hieroglyphen geschrieben werden. Und natürlich die Leserichtung. Und das ist jetzt dann der Übergang zu unserem großen Objekt und das ist die Scheintür der Wenschet. Und die Hieroglyphen können wir hier oben sehen. Es ist einmal das Häschen, siehst du es auch? Darunter die Wasserlinie, dann kommt das Becken und die letzte Hieroglyphe, das halbe Brot, das ist das T für Wenschet. Und wir sind ein modernes Museum. Museumspädagogik gibt es auch nicht erst seit gestern. Also mit anderen Worten, nicht nur ins Gespräch miteinander zu kommen, sondern das, was wir hier mit unserer Museumsarbeit vermitteln wollen, ist zu erforschen und mit Ihnen auch viel Spaß zu haben. Fordern Sie auch die Kleine auf, weil ich glaube, die wird es letztendlich knacken und erforschen können, wie oft der Name Wenschet hier auf dieser Tür steht. Und bevor ich natürlich so eine Aufgabe einleite, haben wir uns einmal unser anderes Objekt mal angeschaut, von oben bis nach unten, also die Schule der Anschauung, dass man also wirklich auch erforschen kann. Und von daher hier für Sie der Tipp, gehen Sie entweder von links nach rechts oder von oben nach unten. Und der Tipp ist immer, suchen Sie nach dem Hasen. Wo entdecken Sie den Namen Wenschet nochmal? Bitte?
Nur einmal zeigen?
Ja, nehmen Sie den Stock, ohne das Objekt natürlich zu berühren.
Genau, hier oben ist der Hase.
Genau.
Ich glaube, es geht von dort nach dort.
Ja, genau. Ja. Wo haben wir noch den Hasen?
Hier auch.
Genau, da auch. Und dann fehlt er nämlich noch einmal. Und jetzt dürfen Sie nicht schwächeln, weil es heißt nämlich dann, dass jede Schulklasse fitter ist als Sie. Ganz, ganz schwierig. Findest du den Hasen nochmal? Es ist natürlich leichter, wenn ich die Einführung mache, dass es sich hier um eine sogenannte Scheintür handelt. Scheintür deshalb, weil durch den Durchgang niemand außer ein Vogel, ein Bar, die in der Vorstellung der alten Ägypter durchkommt, um dann hier für den Verstorbenen die Opfergaben zu nehmen. Und Scheintür deshalb, weil Sie sich das hier vorne wie so ein Ikea-Rollo vorstellen müssen. Und dann, wenn man diese Geschichte vorher kennt, dann finden öfter Menschen dann hier den vierten Hasen und somit den Namen. Und wir sehen aber hier, dass die Leserichtung von rechts nach links ist. Also mit dem Material, mit dem wir unterwegs sind, wollen wir einen anderen Ansatz finden, einen sehr begreiflichen Ansatz, um komplexes Wissen, das letztendlich uns die Wissenschaft zur Verfügung stellt, komplexes Wissen eingängig zu vermitteln. Das ist unser Ziel und das gelingt uns im Grunde genommen sehr gut. Es müssen natürlich Objekte sein, die diese Größe haben, um auch so eine große Gruppe, wie wir es sind. Wir sind hier knapp 30 Personen. So ist ja auch die Größe einer Schulklasse, um dann gemeinsam Spaß zu haben und zu erforschen. Das wäre ja bei einer Führung. Aber das andere Vermittlungsformat, was wir haben, sind Workshops. Das heißt, wir sind in der Regel eine halbe Stunde in der Ausstellung hier drin. Wir entdecken, um hinterher das Gesehene auch praktisch selbst umzusetzen. Und wie das dann funktioniert, also diese Auflösung gibt es dann auch zum Schluss. Okay, und dann übergebe ich wieder an dich.
An indication of how to read the hieroglyphs. And another thing which Egyptians could do is, you see, it's a very flexible system, a very flexible writing system, from left to right, right to left, top to bottom. Great system, very more flexible than Latin script, which is totally boring from left to right. But you could also do some shortage or extension of text depending on the space you have at the wall, for example, in sacred script. And this is something very great, because some hieroglyphs do not only give one sound, but could give 2 or 3 sounds. So therefore, you could compromise or extend words depending on how many hieroglyphs you do in the name. And you can see this, for example, here there is, but this might also be an error for the writing, that the name of the Princess Wenchit is normally 1, 2, 3, 4 signs. Here you can see that it is only 1, 2, 3 signs. There is 1 sign left. And again here 1, 2, 3, 4 signs. But you can see, for example, here there's another sign additionally giving the indication that this is a name, a sign which you do not read. It's just an indicator that these signs before are names. And you could left the sign away if you do not need it, or if there is too less space. So therefore, to fill a temple wall, for example, is a not so tricky task. If you might wonder how the Egyptians could count all the signs that it will just fit in the temple space, because you could, depending on the text, left some signs out or fill some signs in. So the orthography is very flexible and therefore you will not lost information. You could compromise and extend texts without a loss of information. You could in any case read the whole text. So this is a very very typical thing for Egyptian hieroglyphs, that is this flexible of space, of reading direction and of use of the signs.
Okay.
So, and with this knowledge we could proceed.
Sagen wir durchaus auch unseren Schülerinnen und Schülern.
Ja, of course.
Erklären wir. Einen Moment, nein, alles gut. Es handelt sich nämlich um eine Lautsprache. Alexander, wir würden es hier mit einem X schreiben, aber der Laut KS oder auch Taxi. Und das ist ganz, ganz wichtig, den Unterschied, dass es unterschiedliche Sprachfamilien gibt, den Schülerinnen und Schülern zu vermitteln. Und dass sie nur das lateinische Alphabet heißen, heißt nicht, dass die anderen nicht lesen und schreiben können, sondern dass wir auch unterschiedliche Schriftsysteme haben. Also auch das ist uns ganz, ganz wichtig zu vermitteln.
Genau. Yeah, if you do not, thank you for this. So if you do not have any more questions about how to read and write hieroglyphs, you know already anything about this. But there are, of course, some more tricky tasks and gaps which makes it more complicated. In particular, the grammar of the Egyptian language is, of course, not so straightforward like the Latin grammar, and there are more problems.
I would be delighted if you could briefly tell us the story how the hieroglyphs were understood Because this was a centuries past.
Yeah, it is indeed. Yeah. 200 years ago, yeah, this is a major achievement, thank you for this question, a major achievement in scholarship. It was indeed so that the hieroglyphs in the 5th to 6th century, our area, AD, starts to diminish, and then Greek letters took over. And this leads to the situation that no one could read hieroglyphs from the mid-1st century AD onwards. So that means for more than 1,400 years no one could read and understand hieroglyphs, and they were very miraculous. And it was then a French scholar, Jean-François Champollion, who had the lucky situation that some years before the discovery for the decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1822, namely in 798 or 99, I don't know exactly, but in 99 or 98, 700, the Napoleon expedition to Egypt, to conquer Egypt, which totally failed on the military level, was a big success for scholarship, because Napoleon took some scholars with him to make a very complete description of a whole country with all its antiquities and all the people, all flora, fauna, whatever was in there. The Description de l'Égypte, the first task to give a whole description of a total foreign country, and some soldiers who were also in Egypt dig out some inscription, and this inscription was very interesting because it had hieroglyphs on it, had kind of a script on it. I will show you now how the Egyptians could not only write this hieroglyphs but also a script kind of yeah, this small one was discovered. It's more huge and original, but it's here you could see, so hieroglyphs on top, the Rosetta Stone, then the Demotic script, so kind of a Schreibschrift, I don't know, script in how? Italic, yeah, that's it. An Italic version of the hieroglyphs, and Greek. And so the Greek text, of course, was easy to read and to understand and understood. And then from the Greek text, because Champollion already had the idea that the others are translations of this Greek text, he could then decipher hieroglyphs. Of course, he had some additional knowledge which was helpful for him. For example, he already knows how to read the king's name, and that the cartouches gives an indication for the king's name, so he could find Ptolemy, the name of the king, in the hieroglyphs and in the Demotic script and in the Greek text. But also he had knowledge about the latest language development of the Egyptian language, that was Coptic language and Coptic script, and this was important for him. So he had a basic understanding of how the Egyptian language in the latest phase of its development was spoken, and kind of a grammar idea, and then he could apply this to the hieroglyphs. And in 1822, after working very hard in kind of a September date, he had this breakthrough. Then from then onward, Egyptology was born, and people could look back in time very, very far. For the 3rd millennium BCE was very, very exciting, of course. It's more far away, so the pyramids, for example, and texts which were written in the time of the pyramids are more far away from Cleopatra than we are from Cleopatra in terms of time. So if you make a timeline and put Cleopatra more or less in the middle, then the hieroglyphs and then the pyramids are far more away from Cleopatra than your smartphone and you are from Cleopatra. So, and imagine that you could then get into this distance, in this far distance, reading texts which is totally far away from our time. It had totally partly strange ideas about the world and how the world could be. This is very, very exciting. So Egyptology is very tricky.
Ja, und wenn man jüngere Besucher hier im Museum hat, dann sind andere Geschichten genauso wichtig wie die Entdeckung der Hieroglyphen, nämlich dass Champollion schon mit 5 Jahren sich selbst das Lesen und Schreiben beigebracht hat. So der Mythos. ist, dass er mit 11 Jahren das erste Mal eine Abbildung vom Rosetta-Stein gesehen hat und sich vorgenommen hat, als er hörte, dass der Stein noch nicht entziffert worden ist, dass er ihn übersetzen will. 4 Jahre später hat er sich mit der chinesischen Schrift auseinandergesetzt. Er hat andere Schriften studiert, um diesem Geheimnis zu kommen. Und mit 21 Jahren war er soweit. Ich finde das auch ganz, ganz wichtig, jungen Besuchern und gerade auch den Kindern näher zu bringen. Es ist in Ordnung, wenn du dich für irgendwas interessierst. Es ist auch in Ordnung, wenn du dir in den Kopf setzt, große Forscherin zu werden oder Forscher. Es gibt gute Beispiele und das ist auf jeden Fall Champollion und für hier unsere ägyptische Sammlung im Besonderen. Und das ist auch für mich in der Vermittlungsarbeit ganz, ganz wichtig, an Objekten zu arbeiten, aber auch einen Bezug zu den Objekten und vor allen Dingen auch zu den Forschungsergebnissen herzustellen. Und nicht nur, dass die Forschung, natürlich wird sie diskutiert und wir wissen alle, dass es unterschiedliche theoretische Ansätze gibt, aber dass letztendlich Forschung auch von Menschen betrieben wird. Und mit Champollion bekommt die Forschung auf jeden Fall ein Gesicht, genauso wie das.
Ja, danke. Oh, das hatte ich auch noch nicht gewusst, dass er mit 11 Jahren schon irgendwie quasi da anfängt. Ja, man lernt immer dazu. Genau, irgendwie wollen wir mal irgendwie fortfahren. Should we proceed? We have to climb up the next level. The next level of Egyptian language development means also the next level in the building. You are now in a part of the exhibition dealing with the Egyptian gods. So you see that the Egyptians had many, many gods which they venerate. Indeed, hundreds of gods are known from ancient Egyptian culture. You see that sometimes the gods had for our eyes, a very strange appearance or strange looking, like this goddess over there, combining a female body with the head of a lion. The goddess Sekhmet, a very powerful, strong goddess, and so therefore she is combined with a very powerful and strong head. For us it seems weird and unusual. For the Egyptian eye, it is a total clear indication that Egyptian gods are not human and not animals, but they are in between and they combine all abilities from mankind and the natural world and from animals. So therefore they are hyper superficial beings combining this in a very total fascinating way, aspects from mankind and lion. And this is also, of course, you had seen the hieroglyphs. This is also true somehow for the fantastic hieroglyphic writing. What I would like to show you now is, for the multilinguality aspect of the ancient Egyptians, 2 objects over here. So you shall follow me. So now talking about languages and multi-language spoken parts in the Egyptian society, these 2 blocks are somehow important to give you an indication of how in the mid-2nd century BCE the Egyptian society developed into, one could say, an international or multicultural society. Because in this time the Egyptian, one could say somehow, empire was a very much extended area, going in the south towards nowadays Sudan and going in the northeastern part up to the nowadays Levant and Syria. And here you see on an Egyptian relief in Egyptian style, mid-2nd century BCE, about 1350 or so, a group of colored Nubians from the south, which are not so much Egyptians. The Nubians spoke an own language, which is totally different from the Egyptian language at the time. But they are part of the Egyptian military. So already starting in the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptian kings start to expand their empire toward the south, and from then on, people with another language and another cultural background were incorporated into the Egyptian society, particularly as soldiers in the army. So here, people who are living and working in Egypt, but do not have the mother tongue Egyptian, but a foreign language, which then needs to be translated, which then needs to be translators to understand what the foreigners are speaking and telling, and also having the aspect that the foreigners need to learn Egyptian language to survive somehow in the Egyptian society. And here are people, you could see very clear that they had beards, which is unusual for Egyptians. Egyptians avoid to have a beard. The ancient Egyptians at least. So for nowadays Egyptians it's different, and I know that the Islam did some change there, but for the ancient Egyptians, beards are somehow they avoid this. This was not en vogue, but for the people from the Levant, wearing beards was totally the mode of the time, and the fashion of the time, the fashion of the time. And here you see soldiers again from the Levant, again working in the Egyptian army as soldiers. So their language was then Syrian or other languages from these Near Eastern cultures, which also were incorporated into Egyptian society with all the things which you need, translation, and they had an own writing system. The people from the south developed their writing system or their script later. So at that time they do not have an own script, but this people had the cuneiform script already developed, and the cuneiform language, Akkadian language, was somehow a diplomatic language at the time. So if you want to correspond to other kingdoms, like in Middle Ages France, for example, to communicate within royalty, you use the Akkadian language and cuneiform script. Not the Egyptian Keilschrift here, not the Egyptian language, because for practical reasons it is too complicated for foreigners to learn this language, and the cuneiform script was very easy to use. You could write it very quickly, and it was more easy to learn and more easy to write script. So therefore, in the mid-2nd millennium BCE already, we had multilingual qualifications and capacities in Egypt. So therefore, our first instance, mid-2nd century. And now I would like to show you the Egyptian script in the italic writing form, just briefly. We have them here. So here you could see how the Egyptians used, for example, here their writing palettes. We have a writing palette here, and here you see examples of the script, the hieratic script, which the Egyptians used to make administrative notes, literal texts, hymns, religious texts, and so on. They could not only do complicated hieroglyphs on walls, but also a very quick note on a papyrus or an ostrakon, a stone sherd. And you see already here in particular that we are now moving to the 1st millennium BCE, when Greek make its arrival in Egypt and transforming the language capacity in Egypt very, very much. The most huge impact on Egyptian language and writing was the introduction of Greek in the end of the first half of the 1st millennium BCE. So the Greeks arrived in Egypt and very, very much changed. For example, the Greeks introduced money into Egypt, coins, totally unusual. The Egyptians had a natural exchange system. Money was not known. Very happy times, no money at all, and the Greeks introduced money. And from then on, all things in Egypt changed very much. So, for example, in the economic way, but also in the language way. But
wechseln das wieder mit
genau.
Wenn Kulturen sich vermischen, dann gibt es immer Innovation. Und das kann man auch sehr schön am Schulalltag der Schülerinnen und Schüler dann im alten Ägypten erleben. Haben die Schüler ihre Aufgaben, wie man das da vorne in der Vitrine sehen kann, eher auf Steinen aufgeschrieben oder auf Scherben, waren sie durch die Griechen in der Lage, auf Wachstafeln zu schreiben. Das bedeutete, dass sie immer noch keine Schulbücher hatten, weil das finde ich auch nochmal ganz interessant, wenn wir über Schrift reden, auch über den Alltag der Schrift und auch über die Vermittlung von Schrift, mit anderen Worten von Schule zu reden. Auch den Schülern an die Hand zu geben, dass sie sehr viel auswendig lernen mussten. Gut, man hat dann nicht den Nachteil, dass man einen schweren Ranzen zu tragen hat, aber es wurde auch mit sehr, sehr viel Disziplin gelernt. Und es gibt auch durchaus einige Zitate, die besagen, nur ein guter Lehrer ist derjenige, der auch seine Schüler züchtigen kann. Wir haben jetzt hier nicht zu jeder Vitrine in meiner roten Tasche Anschauungsmaterial. Natürlich haben wir das jetzt heute komprimiert und deswegen wundern Sie sich ja nicht, wenn ich meine Tasche jetzt wieder aufmache und dann auch eine Schreiberpalette, wie sie hier im Original ist, Ihnen mitgebracht habe. Ganz wichtig ist ja auch das Schreibwerkzeug und die alten Ägypter haben mit Binsen geschrieben. Binsen ist im Prinzip so eine Rohrpflanze. Und wie kann man dann schön schreiben? Indem man sie anschärft, indem man sie in den Mund nimmt und so zu einem Pinsel formen kann, dass man schreibt mit Rot und Schwarz. Und natürlich brauchen Sie mir die Frage nicht zu beantworten, wie hat man rote Farbe gewonnen, wie hat man schwarze Farbe gewonnen. Ich glaube, der Apparat geht schon bei Ihnen los. Von daher zeige ich Ihnen den roten Ocker, den man im Wüstensand finden kann, den man zu roter Farbe verarbeiten kann. Genauso, dass natürlich in jeder Feuerstelle es Kohle gibt, beziehungsweise Reste, die halt eben zu schwarzer Farbe verarbeitet werden. Ganz, ganz wichtig, weil da geht es oft durcheinander bei Schülerinnen und Schülern, Papyrus. Wie sieht es aus? Man kann sehr gut, wenn man es gegen das Licht hält, sehen, dass Papyrus aus einer Papyruspflanze entsteht. Und zwar indem die Stängel waagerecht oder senkrecht aneinander gelegt worden sind. Und dann sind wir wieder bei unserer Vitrine, nämlich mit so einem Papyrusmesser auseinandergeschnitten worden sind und mit einem Glättstein geglättet worden sind. Ich gebe mal den Papyrus weiter, weil wir uns ja hier in Europa befinden. Und ich finde es ganz, ganz wichtig, weil jeder kennt Papier, gut, mittlerweile kennt auch jeder Bildschirm, aber auch mal ein Pergament in der Hand zu haben und zu wissen, was ein Pergament ist. Denn Sie glauben nicht, wie viele Erwachsene auch nicht wissen, dass Pergament Leder ist, Tierhaut. Und dass es durchaus unterschiedliche Qualitäten gibt. Ich lasse es auch hier rumgehen. Ja, wo kommen wir jetzt hin mit unserer Erzählung oder ich mit meiner? Dass ich an dieser Stelle den Klassen zeige, was wir dann nämlich im Workshop machen. Dass wir eine Wachstafel gemeinsam herstellen. So sieht es aus, also man sieht dann schon mal das Endprodukt und kann es auch durchaus mit dem Original vergleichen. Und diese Erfahrung, es im Original gesehen zu haben, es selbst herzustellen, ich habe immer wieder ganz viel Feedback, wie viel die Kinder am Abend zu erzählen haben in den Familien. Also da immer ganz, ganz wichtig, auch den Bezug zu schaffen zu der Lebenswelt auf der einen Seite, aber auch ganz, ganz wichtig zu den Originalen.
Here now, we are now here somehow surrounded by a relief part, so to speak. We are in some kind of a temple, which in this case is a sacred room in a subterranean building, kind of a tomb for a baboon, for an ape. You could see here the depiction of the baboon, and this particular baboon was buried as a sacred animal of the god Thot, the god for writing and script. And this god for writing and script could appear in the form of a baboon or in the form of an ibis, which you could see here, the combination of a human being with the head of an ibis. And this chapel somehow was for the afterlife of this incorporation. The baboon was venerated as an incorporation of the god Thot, the god for script and writing. And the king who ordered this chapel to be built was here, and this is no one else than Ptolemy I, the first pharaoh of Egypt with the or not the first pharaoh of Egypt, but the Greek pharaoh of Egypt with a migrant background. If Ptolemy I could read and write hieroglyphs, is very clear that he could not. So he needs translators to communicate with his people. However, in the official image and religious programs of temples, Ptolemy I appears like an Egyptian pharaoh. No, you could not make any any signal that he is a pharaoh who could not read and write hieroglyphs, who needs a translation, like the Rosetta Stone. If he wants to know what is on the temple walls, then he needs a priest who could read this, what is written on the wall, or he needs a written translation in Greek to understand what was there. He, however, was clever enough to not make a cultural break or a turn towards the Hellenistic kind of images, but keeping the Egyptian images and kind of Egyptian cult and religion in place, so no change in this regard. But at the same time in Egypt, for example in Alexandria, the Ptolemies built Hellenistic cities with a Greek population, speaking Greek, having Greek temples in Alexandria. And there, Ptolemy I appears, like you could see here, as a Greek ruler in a total different way of portraiture. Here he is the Egyptian pharaoh, and here he is the Greek emperor. And this coins, of course, he needs to pay his soldiers, his Greek soldiers, therefore he needs money. And so the gold coins then were used for this. And here you see another image of Ptolemy I as an Hellenistic ruler. So he developed very clear a strategy that for the Egyptian population, he appears as an Egyptian pharaoh, appealing for the followers, for the Egyptians, and for the Greek part of his population, he appears as an Hellenistic ruler. So there were two cultures then in Egypt, both were very much established, and they start to mingle and to influence each other, but also they somehow keep their characteristics. So the Greeks in Alexandria live like Greeks, speaking Greek and all this, no much Egyptian influence there. However, for example in Thebes or here in Tuna el-Jebel, where this chapel comes from, the system was very much Egyptian with only a very few influence of Greek. However, the Greeks the Ptolemies are very, very reluctant migrant background kings if it comes to learn the foreign language. It is said that no Ptolemaic king ever learned Egyptian. So there were 13 kings of this name. So Ptolemy the 13th was the last one. And this 13 kings totally avoid learning Egyptian. And it was said that only Cleopatra, the very famous Cleopatra the 7th, indeed we have several Cleopatras, and Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra, was number 7. And it was said that this famous Cleopatra indeed was the only queen of the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt who were able to understand the language of the people, of the Egyptians, and it was also said that she could even read and write the demotic and hieroglyphic language and script. So she could write demotic, kind of an italic script at the time in use, and could read hieroglyphs. And of course, you know that she was not only able to speak and communicate with the people in Egypt, which were not Greeks. Of course, her mother tongue is somehow Greek, but she could also speak Latin, which then became important because then, you know, with Caesar and all the stories that she tried together with Caesar to change the system towards the Ptolemaic kingdom, became more influential in the Roman sphere, which the Romans, of course, don't like at all at the time. So if Cleopatra with Caesar arrived in Rome, for the Roman Senate and the Roman elite, it was a total no-go that a queen with own ideas and own visions and own power appear more or less in the public, because in Roman times, women stay at home, take care for the children, do cooking, but no way in politics. So woman in politics is something you don't have in Rome. And so Cleopatra very much came into this woman in policy thing. So therefore, you know that Cleopatra somehow failed to do this thing with Caesar. And Caesar somehow was even though stabbed for not only Cleopatra, but also with his idea in mind to establish a kind of a kingdom like the Ptolemy kingdom in Italy. And then her second chance with the Roman Mark Anton also somehow failed. And then from then on, when Cleopatra did suicide, it was told that she was forced to do so by a certain Octavian, the later Augustus, King Augustus. Then Egypt became part of the Roman Empire, and then another language came into its arrival in Egypt, the Latin language. However, because the Roman emperors regarded Egypt as kind of a very exclusive province of their empire, it was not allowed for foreigners to enter Egypt or to leave Egypt, and therefore the Latin language remains very limited in Egypt. It was not very much spread, and the Greek language still was a very dominant language. 145 to 46 onwards, they forced that any official document in Egypt shall have a Greek translation. So from then on, because the rule was that any official document needs to be translated into Greek, the Greek language became more and more dominant in administration. Any Egyptian needs to have a translated document if he has an official document, and this also leads to a more to an increase in documents with Greek script and Greek language. People at that time, for example, did also have, curiously enough, for the Egyptian administration, an Egyptian name and for the Greek administration a Greek name. So therefore people have two names, so to speak, one Egyptian name and one Greek name. The Greek name for the Greek administration, the Egyptian name for the Egyptian administration, which also sometimes puzzles and confuses, of course, scholars, because you have two names for the same person and you didn't know, is it the same person or not in documents, so therefore it's confusing this administrative thing at the time. And then in roughly about the second millennium AD, when Christianity arrived and make its arrival in Egypt, again major social change and change in language take part. And this I would like to show you in our final stop in our exhibition. And you could follow me here. Ein wirklich tolles Objekt, muss ich sagen. Quasi eines der wirklich schönsten Objekte hier in diesem Teil der Ausstellung. Just on our way to the final object, just a very brief stopover. Here you could see that at that time, so roughly about 100 AD, with the Roman culture, with the arrival of the Roman culture, some new features were introduced into Egyptian burial customs, that is having a portraiture putting on the head of the deceased on a mummified body. So you could very clearly see here a combination of Roman fashion. The person looks totally Roman here, with Roman jewelry and Roman clothes and Roman sandals even. And on the other hand, the wish to have a mummy, so a total Egyptian religious concept. So the fashion was Roman, the daily appearance was that of a Roman noblewoman, but the Roman noblewoman wanted to be buried in a mummified form. So you see again this mixing and mingling of cultural habits in Egypt here in this very nice example. But our final object is more far away. We now arrive in the first, second, third, fourth and fifth century AD. I already mentioned in the second century AD Christianity arrived in Egypt. It was said that that Mark was the first Christian who arrived in Egypt. And from then on, we have first mentioned in 246 or so, already an archbishop who resides in Alexandria. And you could see that in the very beginning, there starts to be a mixture from Egyptian iconography and signs and letters. For example, you remember this kind of a cross with this loop, the word for ankh, for living, combined with the Christian cross here in a very clear manner, meaning that the Egyptian hieroglyph for life, ankh, was used to give the expression that with the cross an eternal afterlife was in mind for the Christians to see the cross as kind of a symbol for life, for eternal life. However, this combination of a non-Christian sign, very much combined with non-Christian religious concepts, with Christian ideas, was not so much what the Christians at that time wanted to have. So they started to skip hieroglyphs and they started to avoid the script of the demotic italic writing, and they started to use Greek letters for their own language. So then it starts that the Egyptians used Egyptian language, not Greek, but tried to write this language with Greek letters, because Greek was the language for the New Testament. And so the Greek letters were somehow the sacred letters which you can use for the Christian religion, contrary to the hieroglyphs which were used for the pagan religion. Hieroglyphs remain for the pagan sphere, which somehow were, you know, for a while together with the Christian new religion in Egypt present. And then the Christians start to use this Greek letters, and for all the sounds which they could not find an equivalent in the Greek letters, they introduced new letters. Therefore, for all of you who are familiar with Greek letters, you will find some letters like this phi over there, or another hori over there, some kind of letters which were not part of the alphabet of the Greeks, to write Egyptian language with Greek letters. And this was also something which helped Champollion deciphering the hieroglyphs, because he was able to read Coptic language, and this language was then named Coptic. But basically it is a kind of Egyptian language written with Greek letters. And this was used by the Christians up until the end of the first millennium AD. Then with the Arab conqueror of Egypt in 671, I think, or 74, in the 7th century AD, the Arabs arrive in Egypt, and from then on another language and another script was introduced into Egypt, the Arab language and Arab script. And then it took a while that the Arab language became the dominant language in Egypt, and pushing away the other languages, namely the Coptic language, the hieroglyphic language, which was in use up until 300 and something, the latest hieroglyphic inscription in Philae, and then with the Arab language, Egypt became, starting from the, I would say the 14th century, 15th century AD, more or less than mono language culture again. So Arab was then also used for the Christians, so the Christians skipped their language as well, so the Coptic language was just used like Latin for use in the churches, but not longer a spoken language, so it was just a language for the church and for the liturgy, and then Arab became the predominant language in Egypt, mono language. Arab was the main language up until Napoleon arrived in 798, and then again there was a problem that foreigners, if you would not say that the Arabs were already rulers with a foreign background, so migrants again invading Egypt, and then the French tried to invade Egypt, they failed, but then the English invaded Egypt, and they did not fail. So then they started an English influence, and then in Egypt, English became the administrative language together with France. So because the Egyptian Antiquity Organization was in the hand of the French, so for the Antiquity Organization, French was the language. For the official part, English was the language. So the Egyptians dealt with two languages. The more intellectual Egyptians tried to spoke more French and avoid English, but anyhow then English became the administrative language, and up until today at least the big cities in Egypt are bilingual, one could say. So English is somehow a language where you could come through in certain parts of the country. Egypt is. Of course, if you could speak Arab, it's very helpful in Egypt. That is totally clear. And today, again, Arab is the only official language. English is no longer an official language, right? For an administrative, no. Yeah. So this is all I could tell you about changing languages, multi-language qualification in ancient Egypt. and up until modern times, you see, it changed very much. Thank you very much for your attention. And now we start with, after a short break, with the workshop, right?
In the workshop room.
In the workshop room, which is also very nice climate and fresh. Thank you.